Board of Directors, Monterey Peninsula Water Management District, Wednesday, May 13th, 2020 at 6:01. Roll call, please.
Director Edwards.
Here.
Director Byrne. Director Byrne.
Here.
Director Riley.
Here.
Director Evans. Let me unmute you. Director Evans.
Here.
Director Hoffman.
Here.
Director Adams.
Here.
And Director Potter.
Here.
All present.
All right.
Somebody doesn't have their mute on.
I'm going to go ahead and mute.
I think you want to mute Catherine Stedman.
Right. All right.
Okay. Will we all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance of the flag, please? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America,
to the republic for
which it stands,
One
one
nation.
nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
For all.
Thank you. Okay, any additions and corrections to the agenda, General Manager?
No, there are none.
Okay,
Move to approve the agenda.
Second.
there'll be a roll call vote.
Okay. Director Edwards.
Approval?
Director Potter.
Aye.
Director Riley.
Yes.
Director Byrne.
Yes.
Director Adams.
Aye.
Director Evans.
Aye.
Director Hoffman.
Yeah, I'd like some clarification because my agenda just says overview of protocol followed by oral communications, attorney's report, and discussion item. Is that what we're voting upon?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, it was, so Director Hoffman, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Unanimous approval.
Thank you. Oral communications. Anyone wish to address the board on matters within the jurisdiction of the district must not list on the agenda, may do so only during oral communication. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes. The public may comment on all other items at the time they are presented to the board. Oral communications are open.
So if anyone has raised hand, and if you are participating by phone, please dial *9, and then I will be able to see if you wish to comment. I'm checking the list. I see no raised hands. So there are no comments.
Thank you, Arlene.
You're welcome.
Next thing on the agenda is the attorney report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening to you, the board, and members of the public. The report on the closed session held by the board on April 20th of this year Director Hoffman was absent. All other directors were present.
30th.
The purpose of the closed session was to consider authorizing litigation against Monterey One Water. The board collectively chose to postpone deciding to initiate litigation and instead chose to provide Monterey One Water an opportunity to respond to concerns of the district. In the closed session, the 6 attending directors provided collective direction that the district should send a letter to Monterey One Water demanding a resolution of concerns related to certification of the Pure Water Monterey Groundwater Replenishment Project, SEIR, and payment of the recent invoice tendered by Monterey One Water. The letter was an offer in settlement meant to avoid initiation of litigation. The board directed an opportunity to be given for each director to offer edits to that letter, which was then to be sent by midday on May 1st. That concludes my report of the closed session.
And Mr. Laredo, just one correction. I heard you say April 20th. I know you meant April the 30th.
I'm sorry, it was April 30th, yes.
All right, thank you. For the record, it's corrected. Discussion items. General Manager?
Yes, this is a single discussion item, but within it will be many other areas of interest to the board, all financial in nature. This is an overview of the fiscal 2021 budget, and I'm going to turn it over to your CFO, Suresh Prasad, to walk you through. We do have a presentation.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave.
Before you get started, public comment will be received on this item after the presentation. Go ahead, Sir Suresh. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, members of the board. Can everyone see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect. Hey, Arlene, would you do me a favor and just mute all the participants that just joined?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you. So this is our annual budget process where we basically present the budget to the board, either in the form of a board workshop or in the form of a regular board meeting. There is no formal action required out of this. However, there are basically where we basically take comments from the board at this point, and then we bring that back into our final budget that comes in June for final adoption, which will happen on June 15th. So bear with me. There's a couple of slides, but it shouldn't take very long. So we still follow the 2004 board adopted strategy. There's the 3-pronged strategy in there. One of them was to develop the annual balanced budget every year. We have not been able to do that for the last few years, and one of the primary reason is because of the Pure Water Monterey project. That's been taking quite a bit of a chunk of change from our budget. So it has not been balanced. We've been balancing it using our fund balance, our reserves. Also, the second bullet is the preserve existing services and to enable the district to carry out our mission and vision. And we have been able to do that with all of the budgets that we've been bringing to your attention. One of the other strategy was also maintain a 5% general operating reserve and then to get it over to 50%. That varies. We've never been below, in the last 10 years, I should say, we've never been below 5%. We have been over 50% at times. Last year we were 88%. I believe this year, if my numbers are correct, we are at 49%. So that number kind of like varies anywhere from 5 to, I think the highest I've seen is like 92%. So that kind of like varies as we go into with projects for each year. We were mindful for this fiscal year 2021. We were mindful of the current status. Of course, the big one is the COVID-19. We have taken that into account. We have basically looked at the numbers of how our revenue is going to factor in for the next 12 months. So all of that has been taken into account. The original budget came from the division request, which was compiled, and then our team management met. And if I don't mess up the date, I believe it was May 4th or something. It was beginning of the month. We all met remotely via video conferencing, and we went over the budget itself. The format of the budget is the same as the previous year, so that's kind of like easy on the eyes. There's no sudden change in the format itself. And the last bullet, as I had mentioned before, the COVID-19 impact we have evaluated and included in this budget. And I'll talk about more of that as we hit each of those revenue line items. As I had mentioned on the onset, that despite our effort to try and balance the budget, we have been using reserves, and this budget for 2021 does include use of reserves. And I'll also highlight that where and what amount is being used to balance the budget. The reserve balance, the operating reserve balance is at 49% of the operating budget. And if you recall, the earlier chart said anywhere between 5 and 50. And so fairly close to that. The total budget size for this year is a little over $21 million. And if I can move my little video thing, thank you. A little over $21 million. It is lower than the 1920 budget by about 4%, and it really doesn't have much significance in terms of whether it's higher or lower than previous years, but we'd like to highlight how it is factoring against the previous budgets. Most of the impacts are actually in the project line. This budget does assume that it's a full year of user fee revenues, and basically it's based on the estimated CalAm collection of water revenues. This is where the COVID-19 impact comes into play. We've looked at the budget. There are two factors in it. One of them is there going to be a decrease in water consumption? Because if there is a decrease in water consumption, of course, that will reduce our user fee revenue. And CalAm's revenue is segregated, like 2/3 are residential and 1/3 is business. Of course, most of the businesses are closed right now. We've started seeing somewhat little downward trend in the water usage. We can't quite pinpoint on that yet, but we have taken that into account. We have adjusted our user fee revenue. One of the other component to the user fee is basically not just water consumption, but if there's going to be a delinquency, because if there is a delinquency, we do not collect on that revenue until CalAm collects on it. So we have taken that into account. We have reduced our user fee revenue by about 15% over previous years. As you can recall, the user fee revenue is, it's not really stable. It basically goes all over the place because it's just predicated based on the consumption. So we looked at the last 2.5 years of history that we have in collections, and then we adjusted it that way. Of course, we will monitor the collection throughout the year, and we will get another shot at it come January. So we will do the mid-year budget process. We will definitely go ahead and adjust it if we see an upward trend or if we see a further downward trend. But at this point, we feel that putting a 15% number is a less number is quite prudent to balance the budget. And if I can have my slide work here. Full year of water supply charge included in this proposed budget. That's another assumption. We are assuming that we will continue to collect the water supply charge all of this fiscal year. All of the property tax revenue, the assumption is that we are going to be collecting that. The COVID-19 impact is also included in there as well. On the water supply charge, we have reduced that by about $100,000 for the fiscal year, and that $100,000 is not really the actual revenue itself, but what it's saying basically is the property tax delinquency, because if the county does not collect the property tax and then the water supply charge that's listed on the property tax, we don't get paid. So we've reduced that there. On the property tax revenue, we've kept it relatively flat to what was last year. Typically, we adjust them between 2 to 3% based on our historical trend. We don't yet see the property tax, the property values going down. Even if it does go down, it's not going to impact on the property tax right away. It's going to take a while for it to get impacted, but the collection is going to have a direct impact. So we've kind of like kept it relatively flat. And of course, on this one, as I said, on the user fee, we will continue to monitor it throughout the year, and then come mid-year budget process in January, we will adjust it if it's a upward trend or if we see that it goes down any further. But we just felt that it's prudent to put all of these numbers into the revenue side, meaning the downward adjustments, knowing that the impact is going to be there. Some personal cost savings. We continue to outsource our HR, IT, and GIS operations. HR started about 2.5 years ago. We started outsourcing. GIS was about 1.5 years or about 2 years when the GIS person left. We outsourced that. And then, of course, IT last September, when our IT manager retired, we tried the contract outsourcing, and that seems to be working fine. So combine all of those three, when we pay out on the consultant side, the operation side, and we take into account how much we would have paid in salary and benefits, there is about a $250,000 savings. So we continue to do that. Due to the COVID-19, we have decided they're all vacant or new position, and there's 4 of them existing that needs to be filled within the district. We are going to suspend that until January 1. And again, we'll continue to monitor the situation and see where we stand basically after 6 months mark.
So just to stay on that topic for a second, you may recall at the beginning of the current year, we came to you to approve 3 new positions that might get filled later in the fiscal year. With the current events and as the revenue position that Suresh has pointed out, we're basically treating those 3 positions as temporary layoffs by continuing through January. And then we had our senior fisheries biologist leave mid-year as well. So we're treating that as kind of a layoff. That's why nothing's going to get even potentially brought back to you until January. We may end up having to make a request for one of the junior fisheries people to come on board in December, but we'll keep you posted on that.
If I may, on this topic, usually during the summer season, we have some temporary hires or part-time hires to get through the fish rescue. Is that still a go, or will that be suspended?
Those are all still a go. Those are in the budget.
Okay, thank you.
Just to go over some of those large budgeted expenditures that's included in this budget, you'll see a big whopping $3.9 million budget for the ASR chemical building. You recall this project was approved in last fiscal year. We did not, or are not going to be able to complete the entire project through June. So we are carrying forward the close to $4 million into this fiscal year. So this is kind of like a carryover project, and you'll see there's a carryover line item of about $6 million. And so that's most of where the carryover projects are coming from. The operation of ASR Phase 1 and the Phase 2, these are reimbursable projects. Basically, we operate those facilities and it gets reimbursed through CalAm by CalAm ratepayers. We have a potential pure water Monterey well at $3 million price tag. This is a placeholder, and I'll just pause for a second if Dave wants to share anything on that, Dave.
Yeah, we just day before yesterday received engineering estimates on potential 3rd well. The range of potential estimates exceeds $3 million that we put into this document a week ago. We're not clear if it's going to be up to the district to 100% finance it. Monterey One Water is going to look at some financing options. They're running out of the ability to finance water supply with their reserves. So we'll keep you posted on this one. But it's this is the item that likely pushes us out of balance and will require us to tap into some reserves, this and the Measure J work.
And just to add to that, we had initial discussions internally among staff that we are thinking of doing this as a financing project, meaning we finance it and get recovered through the rates over the next 10 or 15 year period so that we get made whole for the project. The next one is the Pure Water Monterey electrical hookup. This is a $900,000 ticket. Dave, you want to add anything to that?
Well, that's the amount that we feel we might be on the hook for. This was a 75%, 25% item. We took it to water supply planning and then put it on hold with administrative committee because the specifications for the project, as well as supply chain issues related to COVID, resulted in bids that we think were substantially higher than what the market could bear. So Monterey One Water is looking at rebidding the project, changing the specifications if it can help, perhaps in a better environment where supply issues are a little less aggravated, but we'll be keeping track of that one. It'll need to be done during this fiscal year. There is an agreement to get some funding internally from the Regional Waste District and from Marina Coast Water District, their participation. So we'll come back with a formula especially if it exceeds 900,000 from the district, but that's a work in progress.
The next line item is the operating reserve from Clearwater Monterey project. Part of this is a carryover from last fiscal year, which was the initial 1,000 acre feet of reserves. We have not been able to bank all of that water in the ground, and we will not be able to do it until June. So some of it will carry over into this upcoming fiscal year. And then also there's an added about 150 additional acre feet of water that goes towards the secondary reserve, the operating reserve. So that's to add to that $1.1 million total.
And on this one, the cost per acre foot will go up in the next fiscal year. So we're already paying for, the front deposits to the operating reserve at the current fiscal 1920 rate. We will be establishing a company water rate for CalAM's purchases. And the remainder of the district's purchases for the operating reserve in this fiscal year will be at that same rate. You will approve that rate with the approval of the budget in the June board meeting.
So just a correction, Dave, it's not 1920, it's 2198 or 2197.
No, I meant the 1920 fiscal year that we're currently in. But the rate that we're currently paying in that year is 2198, and the proposed rate for next fiscal year is 2442.
Correct. There's some Los Padres Dam plan work. These are all carryover projects from last fiscal year. We have a local water projects in here. Basically, about $200,000 is a carryover from last fiscal year that we feel is going to happen in this fiscal year, in the upcoming fiscal year, and then there's additional $100,000 in there. There is some CalAM diesel project work, about $50,000 worth. The Monterey Water System ongoing Measure J work, $600,000. This is a carryover project from last fiscal year. Board approved not to exceed $1.2 million. We feel that only $600,000 may get expended in 1920. The remainder is in the proposed fiscal year for $600,000. Small amount geochemical study, $55,000. Yeah, go.
Back on the Measure J work, we have not assumed any board action favorable or disfavorable for the decision to do a resolution of necessity and pursue this any further. So if and when that decision gets made, if it's the September-October timeline, there could potentially be, in the current fiscal year, additional costs for going to bench trial and all of that preparation. That is not reflected anywhere in this budget because we're not presuming any outcome.
A geochemical study, $55,000. Fish rearing facility and fish-related activities, it's a budget of about $487,000. It's all shown in the project line item. Riparian and erosion control activities, about $42,000. And then hydrologic monitoring, about a little over $100,000. And these are all that I'm reading. All of these projects are listed in the projects part of the budget in detail. Conservation related activities, these are not reimbursable. That's about $375,000. This is buying devices, equipment, doing brochures and outreach, those type of activities. The rebates, conservation rebates, $700,000. This gets reimbursed through CalAM by CalAM ratepayers. And then the remainder of the Sleepy Hollow project, the design and construction of the new intake system, the $3,000 is a carry forward from last fiscal year. We feel the project's not going to get completed by June, so we are carrying over about $300,000 into 2021. So overall, when you look at all the project cost, it's a total of $13.7 million for this proposed year. That number will actually go up by the time I come to you in June by about another $2.3 million. I was just told this afternoon that we have the what's called the grant project, the IRWM grant project for $2.3 million that did not make the budget. The good news is that it is going to have a revenue opposite of their expenses. So even though the expense is going to go up by 2.3, the revenue is going to go up by 2.3 as well. So there's not going to be any impact to the bottom line. The project cost overall is about a 6% reduction over last fiscal year. So as you
just clarification on IRWM. So we were just given notice of award either Monday or Tuesday of this week. Might have been Friday of last week. So it will be a significant change when you see the project costs. And I know Suresh just alluded to $2+ million, but that's the timing issue between the preliminary budget and the final budget.
Right, it's going to have the offset revenue line as well, so really not a bottom line difference. The personal cost when you're comparing year to year, this year is about, somebody saying something?
I wanted to ask the question of how much was the Irwin grant?
I believe Maureen mentioned was like $2.3 million.
Thank you.
The personal cost, it's about 3% over prior fiscal year, and that's if you take in all of the positions that we have in there, basically the COLA increases, and then the positions that going out, all of that, if you take all that, throw it in the mix, it's about a 3% increase, which is fairly reasonable. Service and supplies, it's a 4% increase over prior fiscal year. There are some line items there that you'll see there's some reductions, there's some line items that goes up. Two of our significant, two line items have significant increases in there, which is worth mentioning. One of them is our property liability insurance that shot up about 40% over prior fiscal year. And we did inquire about that as to why it is. And it's basically because we belong to SDRMA pool. And what they were saying is insurance cost all over California has gone up recently. And then to make matters worse is that the pool had experienced a lot of loss factor. And so they had to raise the amount for the insurance for everybody. They also alluded to mentioning something to the effect that some of this has been caused by the wildfires that was going on over the last few years. So all of this has come home to roost now, and we saw a 40% increase. On the workers' comp side, we did see about a 27% increase in the insurance cost as well. And again, that applies to basically our experience factor over the last 3 years. We have had some, not major, I would not say major, but there have been workers' comp claims continuously for the last 3 years. And as a result, our experience factor has actually gone up quite a bit, which pushed us to a 27% increase on the insurance side. So service and supplies is about 4% increase over prior year. Legal expenses, we are keeping the same level as prior fiscal year. We've been tracking that separately. Our administrative committee looks at those expenses, and so we feel that keeping it at the same level, we should be in line. Contingency, we like to carry a $70,000 line item in there just in case. Basically, this is kind of like a what if scenario. If something happens and we have not budgeted for it, we can draw upon this line. Last few years, we have really not touched it, but the placeholder line is there. The debt service payment that's assumed in this budget as well, $230,000, formerly Robber Bank, now Mechanics Bank loan. And then we have fixed asset.
Yeah. Pause on that. This is an item. So the Mechanics Bank loan, formerly Robber Bank loan, we did come to the board with alternate funding ideas for making the payoff at the due date, which is still 2023, I believe. This budget does not include any additional monies for a sinking fund or set aside to build up reserves for paying off the Mechanics Bank loan.
Correct. And we will get that opportunity towards the end of this budget presentation. There is another slide which I'm going to be talking about in terms of reserve policies, and the board is welcome to opine on that. Basically, if you want us to add something in there, we can do that, but you have to look at the balances right now and see where we stand. Fixed asset purchases, it's about 3% increase over prior fiscal year, 220,000. Some of it is, and we'll go, the fixed asset one, we'll go into a little detail. Some of it is a carryover.
Suresh, back up just one question on the mechanics loan. Are we paying any principal on this payment, or is it principal and interest or interest only?
It's principal and interest.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, by June 23, I believe the outstanding principal is going to be, if I'm not mistaken, $3.1 million. The original loan was a $4 million loan.
Thank you.
We are setting aside monies into the general reserve, and this is kind of like, I'll have to explain this one when we get to the using of the reserve side of it. But we had financed in last fiscal year a Pebble Beach reclamation tank. And Dave, I believe it was a 2 million gallon tank, right?
Yeah, it's a 2.5 million gallon tank that typically keeps about 2 million of volume in it.
So we had financed that project. We gave Pebble Beach Reclamation Project $1 million with the assumption they were going to pay us $500,000 in 2021 and the other $500,000 in 21-22. And this all gets paid through the ratepayers. So basically, the $500,000 is going to become due in November of 2020. And so that's in this budget. And so what we've done, because we used our reserves to pay for that project, we are taking that money that comes in when we are setting it back to our general reserve. So that $500,000 gets pushed back into the general reserve. Pension reserve and OPEB reserve, 100,000 each. We started this project, this process about 3 years ago, and we said we'd like to do seed money and we'd like to set aside some money towards the pension and OPEB reserve. Every year continuously, we've been doing that. This is the third year, so we'd still like to continue doing that, funding 100,000 each to those funds. Capital reserve, what used to be called capital equipment reserve, now we've identified that as capital reserve only, and the reason being is because now it's funding for both equipment and renewal and replacement. So this $266,000 that we are setting aside basically funds about $217,000 in repair and replacement fund and about little under $50,000 for the equipment reserve. So $266,000 gets put aside towards capital reserve now.
So I have a question on the pension reserve. How much is in that reserve account?
So we have 200,000 each, 200 in pension and 200 in OPEB.
Okay.
And so with this year, in 2021, with this 100,000 each, they'll both get 300,000 each.
I see. Thank you.
This is the fixed asset I was talking about, the $220,000. The computer upgrades, that's basically about $25,000 is funded from our previously accrued reserve fund, capital reserve fund. And then the remainder is basically a carryover from prior fiscal year. AV system upgrade, it is a carryover from last fiscal year. We've put in the budget. We have not been able to get to that. The backup generator project is still out there. We have not paid anything for that. So that's still a carryover project from last fiscal year. The vehicle purchase for the WIA program, that's delayed a little bit, but that's going to happen in this fiscal year. So that's a carryover from last fiscal year. And then the replacement vehicle, 33,000, that's a carryover project as well. So all in all, about 200,000 of this fixed asset purchase are basically carried over from this 1920 budget into 2021 budget. We had budgeted for it, we just did not get to do it. So looking at the expenditure summary, you'll see little over 50% of our expenditures equate to project expenditures. That's $11.4 million total. We've got about reimbursement projects, $2.2 million. So in the project side, if you add all of those together, because reimbursements are kind of like projects as well, that's about 66% of our budget. 2/3 of our budget goes towards project expenses. You'll see the personal cost, very small. It's about 20% of the total budget. We like to see that at a low number. Service and supplies, about 7%. And then you have all the other small categories, which are less than 5%, 5% or less. Talking about the revenue side, the user fee, we have reduced that from $5 million to 4.25. And this, again, takes into account the COVID-19 impact. The water supply charge, we previously were budgeting 3.4. This year is 3.3. And we are taking into account some delinquencies that we don't think it's going to get through. Property tax, keeping it flat as fiscal year 1920. And again, no increase there. And we think that the increase will get chewed up by the delinquency. The capacity fee, we have reduced that, taking into account that there may not be that many connection fees coming through. And again, this is basically looking at our historical trend and see where we stand, and that's how we budget it. So again, these are just guesstimate numbers. We'll get to adjust all of these in January if we see the numbers are kind of like trending upwards. Permit fee also taken into account, a reduction there. The interest, there are some reduction there as well. We are losing some interest rates now. We have some that's tied into CDs that have higher yields, but they will all mature over time as well. Some are maturing this fiscal year, so we're not going to be able to renew them at that same high interest rate. So that's going to come down, I would say quite significantly, because previously it was like 280,000. And there's some small amount of reimbursement revenues coming in. So total district revenue is about $10.4 million. This does not take into account reimbursements. This is where the reimbursements are. So the CalAM reimbursements, the ASR Project 1, Project 2, CalAM rebates, these are all in that first line, $1.7 million. We have some grant money coming in. This is tied to the Sleepy Hollow project. There's some other grants, the DEC grant, Disadvantaged Community Grant. So all of those grants comes in at about $328,000. There's some small reimbursements, direct reimbursements. That's $126,000. The water master reimbursement, we do some logistical stuff for the water master, and so that gets reimbursed. The reclamation project, we get the administrative overhead and the administrative time spent on the project that gets reimbursed by the project. The legal and recording reimbursement, these are direct pass through when customers pay for them. This is what it is, $22,000. And then here's the reclamation project, the $500,000 shown coming in. And this is again the first half of the project financing cost that we had spent last year. So the total reimbursement revenue totals to $2.7 million. So the district revenues, when you add all of the district revenues, the top portion, which is basically just district fees, that is about 9% less than what last year was. And like I had mentioned, COVID impact is in there, and that's one of the reasons why you see a little decline in there. The reimbursements, 28% over last fiscal year, and reimbursements tied directly to on the project side. So that basically fluctuates year to year. Carryover from prior fiscal year, this is a huge number, and about $4 million out of this is basically tied to the ASR project. Then there are some other projects in there as well, basically the operating reserve, the Measure J work that's been continued, and Sleepy Hollow project, and a couple of other projects in there that was carried over from prior fiscal year. And then the capital reserve, this line item basically says that we had previously accrued money set aside for the computer upgrades and also for the replacement district vehicle. So both those projects, both those equipments we are buying, but we are using the previously accrued money. So that's what that capital reserve amount is. Basically, we were setting it aside. Now we just go and draw from it and we buy the equipments. The fund balance, this is what shows we need to balance our budget. Little under 1.5, probably another $600 would make it 1.5. But if you do the math, basically taking what's out of the reserve and then how much we are putting again into the reserve, like the pension, the OPEB, and the $500,000 on the general reserve, basically the Pebble Beach money coming in. If you do all of that, it's only basically the net impact is like $599,000 or $600,000. So, but all in all, this is how we need, or this is what we need, the $1.5 million shown on the revenue side to balance the budget that comes to a little over $21 million. And if you look at
and a way to think about that, as I mentioned earlier, is the budget includes the $600,000 of previously approved Measure J related expenses, which is almost a one-to-one offset to the number that Suresh just said. And then the expectation of potential development of a third deep injection well for Pure Water Monterey. Those are the two that kind of pushed us over and required the use of that fund balance.
So the revenue summary, if you look at it, water supply charge makes about 16%. User fee makes about 20% of the total revenue. Property tax about 10%. And then the miscellaneous on the left-hand side, limit fees, capacity fee about 2%, reimbursements about 12% of the budget, fund balance about 7%. And then the carry forward, a large number this year, that's 30%. And that's where all of your projects that was budgeted last fiscal year did not get completed. That's all hitting that carry forward line. So the sources and uses, basically, we'd like to show this on a summarized level. Total expenditures, 20.07. We setting aside 966,000 in reserves, and this is a combination of that 500,000, 200 for the pension OPEB, and then 267,000 or 66,000 for the capital reserve. So all of that makes it into 966. And then that's a total 21. The district revenues 10.4, the reimbursements 2.6, and then the carry forward and reserves. So carry forward was $6.2 million, and then the reserves was 1.5. So both those numbers make up to that 7.8. So that's how we balance the budget, using the reserves, and matches our sources to our uses. We also like to show this real briefly, the 5-year revenue summary. You'll see that stays fairly level. The 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19, those are the actuals. The 1920 is budgeted number, and 2021 is what's the proposed number. So you'll see for the last 3 years, it was relatively flat, all of those colored charts in there. But 2021 does show that it's a little decline, and basically it's to do with some of those impacts that we've taken into account. And again, we show the expenditure side as well, relatively flat for the last 3 years, and those last 3 years were the actual numbers. The 1920, 2021 again are the budget numbers, and the green bar is basically what's the project expenditures. So those are always sort of like not stable. I mean, it goes like all over the place because depending on what projects we are doing. In the last 2 years, meaning 1920 and 2021, we have some hefty projects in the budget. We'd like to show this analysis of the reserve. And what I'd like to mention is that there's a detailed reserve page included in the budget. That is actually page 23 of the budget itself. That will have a little different numbers. We found a little error in our calculation on the reserve side. And so this is a corrected version. And when we do the June budget, it will have the corrected version in there. So what we are showing here, basically the 0630 2020, the original number, that's the original budget. We had estimated the total reserve to be at little over $14 million. Then we came around and we did the mid-year budget, the 0630 2020 mid-year budget that was adopted in February of this year. And the total reserve balance dropped down to $11.4 million. And the reason was we basically added the Measure J cost in there, $1.2 million. We added the ASR facility cost, which if you recall, was about close to $3 million more than what we had projected it to be. So, and we also had the operating reserve water. There was some cost differential in there because we were estimating the cost at 1,700 acre feet to 2,200 acre feet. So some of those other projects in there that made it there, that ended up taking our reserve balance, or will take our reserve balance at this point, estimated to be 11.4 at the end of June 30th, 2020. What we are proposing now is 06/30/21. You'll see that the reserve number, total reserve number, goes down to $10.8 million, and the difference there is like about 600,000, 597 something. Litigation, there's no change to first 4 lines. Pension, OPEB, you'll see each year it goes up by 200,000. And then the operating reserve, basically, you'll see that that's kind of like going down. And that's where we basically, when we use money to balance budgets, this is where it comes out of the operating reserve. And again, the disclaimer there, the very bottom, is that this is about the operating budget. Operating reserve is about 49% of the operating budget.
And by the way, when Suresh referred to page 23 of the budget, for those of you who have packets that in the upper right-hand corner have 2 page numbers, the top page number is the packet page number, and the bottom page number right below it is the budget page number. So the reserves on page 23 of the budget are actually page 30 of the packet.
Right. My reference is always to the budget page numbers. Just showing the reserve analysis.
Suresh, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Could you go back just for one more minute? I wanted to make some adjustments. Thanks.
Move that out of the way.
Thanks. Good to go.
All right. So what I'm showing here, basically just in a graph form, in a pie chart form, where all those reserves are, what percentage of it to the total reserve. So you'll see 80% is sitting in the general operating reserve, and then 2% in litigation insurance. Capital reserves going up about 7% now. Flood drought 3%, debt reserve 2%, and then pension OPEB at 3% each. What we also do with every budget cycle is we like to show the future obligations commitments just so that it's out there. The board members are able to see what may come up in the future. About $400,000 we've got towards the water allocation process that may come up in this next fiscal year, or the 21-22 fiscal year, or further into the year. 3.1 million rubber bank loan comes due June 2023. Pure Water Monterey reserve. This is an additional reserve towards the operating reserve and the drought reserve. So all of that in the future years, that totals to about $2.5 million that we have to bank on the water. The pension obligation, that again, we present the board each year with the pension OPEB obligation numbers. So as of June 30th, 2018, those numbers were 5.1 for the pension side, and the June 30th, 2019, OPEB obligation was 4.5 million. So total, all in all, obligations commitments that we have is about little over $15 million in the future. And that potentially, that changes from year to year. At this point, what we'd like to do is we'll dive into some of these other items, and this is kind of like tied to the budget, but we'd like to talk about this and maybe take some input from the board as well, if there are some input. What we'd like to talk about now is 4 different items. The first one is the PERS OPEB. And I keep saying OPEB. OPEB is the other post-employment benefits, and everybody knows PERS. So the PERS current fiscal year cost for the PERS side, it's $654,100 that is programmed into this budget. And then on the OPEB side, it's $129,000. And the OPEB benefits that we are paying, these are retiree medical benefits. And so that totals to $129,000. It jumped up a little bit this year because we've got 2 new additional retirees that joined on the plan. So all that is programmed into the current year budget. The PERS OPEB reserve fund, setting aside $200,000 this year, will make that fund go to $600,000. That's a good starting point, where we started about $100,000 each. We've been adding gradually each year. So this is actually in the right direction that we are heading. The PERS and the OPEB benefits, those don't come due right away. Basically, those kind of like a rolling mortgage. Every year you'll see a different obligation numbers. But we'd like to set aside a asset on the flip side, meaning the reserve fund, so we can basically point to it and say, hey, at least we've got this money accrued that we could potentially pay down some of these liabilities at any time in future. So we'd like to continue adding more to the PERS OPEB reserve fund, and we definitely are open for board interaction on that as well. In the event that board wants us to set aside more money, we can start planning for that in the future as well. But these are some of the things that we'd like to bring to your attention. So PERS was the first one. The capital reserve, as I had mentioned, the renewal and replacement fund, now that's added to the capital reserve fund, set aside as capital reserve. Previously, it was called the capital equipment reserve. And in this current fiscal year, we are booking $217,000 for the facilities repair and replenishment fund, and a $49,900 towards the equipment, and a detailed called the I'll get the capital asset replacement repair schedule. That is actually listed on page 18 of the budget packet, and you'll see if you add the 2 numbers together, the 217 and 49.9, it comes to 266,900. On that page, you'll see how we ended up with the $266,000 that we're booking aside. And every year we continue, or our goal is going to be to continue booking aside some money towards the capital reserve.
So on that table, should you go to it, the last 4 lines now are facilities rather than equipment. So it's Sleepy Hollow and ASR.
Right, and the capital reserve component part of it, basically, we've had this going on for over a decade now. The only new addition is now we adding the facilities onto the capital list. The reserve policies, these are the categories we have on the reserve side. The litigation insurance, the flood drought, the capital reserve, the pension OPEB reserve, debt reserve, and the general reserve. The only one that has external hold on any of these reserves or a commitment is basically the debt reserve fund, the 222,000. We are obligated by the loan documents to keep that set aside. So that number has basically a fixed number and a commitment that we have to maintain that at that level. All of these other ones, there really is not a policy that says how much money we should set aside, with the exception of general reserve, just says basically anywhere from 5% to 50%. But over the years, we've kind of like gradually added new stuff. 3 years ago, we added the pension OPEB reserve. We've just changed the capital equipment reserve to capital reserve. This is where basically if we needed to, we could potentially throw in another reserve fund for Rabobank reserve fund and start banking some money towards that reserve fund, or if there's any other reserve fund that we basically need to think about or start to plan about, that's basically, again, part of this discussion dialogue that we can have. And by all means, we can add to this list. And if there's a number that board wants to set aside for any of these reserve policies, we can also take that into account. The one thing we did was we went out to GFOA and CSMFO. These are the two financial organizations that basically lay out these standards for governmental sides. And basically they have some policy samples, but no one agency is basically setting aside a magic number that says, yeah, you know what, everybody should do it this way, because every agency has different needs, different type of agency. So they all have different different reserve requirements. For example, litigation insurance, there's not very many agencies that will have that kind of reserve, that line item. Not very many agencies will have a flood drought reserve. Now, more and more agencies do have the pension OPEB, but basically they don't have a magical number that says, yeah, you know, every agency should bank 20% of their operating reserve or something like that. So this is kind of like a number that's based on how the entity wants to set aside its reserve numbers.
So I have a question. Is there currently a game plan for how to retire the Rabobank loan?
Right. So what we brought to you were 5 or 6 different options, and our recommendation was, in conjunction with the budget process, if we felt either A, our reserve position was strong enough, you could, as Suresh has pointed out, we could create a new reserve, basically a sinking fund, where we take current reserve balances, because we don't have surplus of revenue over expenditures, so it'd just be taking balances from the reserves and from the general reserve and segregating it, with the goal of basically trying to, by mid 2023, so you've got this budget takes us to 21, the next one takes us to 22, and the next one takes us to 23. So it'd be almost $1 million a year that you'd set aside to build that sinking fund, so that you'd have $3 million sitting there June 1 of 2023 or June 30. We've not done that here, but that's one of the discussion items if you choose to, or it could be a portion, you know, not a full $1 million, but something to get us further along the way.
On that point, I thought one of the options was to even, maybe it sounded complicated at the time, but refinancing that obligation. And so there are several approaches to it, not just retiring it.
Right.
I had another question on the general reserve. Suresh, you made a reference to I think you said the district policy was to maintain it between 5% and 50%. I don't know. You made some reference that made me think you said that. I thought the policy was to try to bring it up to around 50% and not keep it, not assume that 5% is desirable at all.
Correct, Director Riley. Basically, in 2004, the board adopted this strategy, and it was basically at that point, it was to create it or set it at minimum 5%, and then over time bring it to about 50%. So you're right. It did say get it from 5% to 50% over time.
And we're at close to 50% now, based on the budget.
Right. This one is 49%. If you look at last year's budget, it was at 88%. So basically, when we do the budget, basically all depends on how much our capital project needs are. If you recall, last fiscal year and this fiscal year, we've had some hefty capital projects in about $6-7 million that's been drawing down on our reserves. So if we didn't have much of the capital projects, we'd definitely be over 50%. But 49%, yes, you could say it's close to 50%.
I just want to pick up again on Director Burns' comment about the Rabobank loan. It seems to me there needs to be a balancing act, at least projecting a few years ahead about the need for capital expenses that get carried over and unexpected. Maybe Jay has something to do with this too. But try to balance so that our reserve policy should, in my opinion, should be in the neighborhood of 35-40% comfortably, or at least target wise, and really not go below. That's what I'm trying to get to related to Director Burns' comment about the Rabobank loan. I think it all can be done the way things seem to be going these days, but then we've got an odd year, I think, ahead of us.
Well, and if you did set up a segregated sinking fund for the Mechanics Bank loan, Rabobank loan, it's still in the reserves. So your total reserves would be the same total. And because it would be discretionary, if something bad happened where you needed to tap into your reserves, it would be there available for you. You would just defer your ability to retire it at the balloon payment date.
Right. But keep in mind that 49% number will go down because what we do is we measure the general reserve against the operating budget. So basically, if you take money from the general reserve and set aside as a separate line item, total reserve is still going to be the same dollar amount, but your general reserve number is going to go down.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I have a couple of
At this
questions
point,
as well.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, basically, whether it's a separate line item for operating reserve or whether it's a general reserve line item, that basically is at the board discretion. That, for example, when the Rabobank Mechanics Bank loan comes due, we can turn around and just take it from the general reserve and pay it. That's entirely up to the board.
That'll be an interesting conversation to have. I know that you indicated that we do not have any funding in here for the bench trial, and should we go to the bench trial. And I am just wondering whether or not it has been resolved, whether we can use any of the reserve funds that we have to help assuage the costs that I know will be significant for that. Or is there some other little pot of money that we're assuming that might be there?
Secret stash.
That's what I like about you, sir.
Dave, you want to address that, or you want me to take?
Yeah, we call it the City of Bell Fund. No, it would have to come out of the general reserve, and to date, we didn't budget for the election costs because we didn't want to assume that they would gather the signatures. We didn't budget for the first year of feasibility expenses because we didn't want to presume that the board, because the election happened and the expenditures happened in the fiscal year, we didn't budget for those as well because that would have been presuming that the initiative passed. And so we've had the same approach. So when you authorized additional work in December, there was no budget for it this year. And so if you should decide to go with a condemnation action, we would have to pull it from the general reserve, budget it, compare it to our existing reserve amounts, and go from there.
Okay. And then again, sticking with the idea with reserves, I share your thought that there probably will not be such a major hit on our budgets this year, because we will feel the property tax, the devaluation, as you had indicated, next fiscal year. So we're very prudent in the way that we approach this. But I'm wondering if there are any cost saving measures that we should be looking at for this year, acknowledging that we've got a very questionable future ahead as far as what the pandemic is really going to do to all of the budgets of the water district, the county, our own personal budgets. Is there anything that we should be thinking about putting in place now that will better position us as we move into the next year, rather than just waiting until we get the budget next year and try to move forward?
Well, the starting point is that we've authorized but not filled positions.
Mm-hmm.
And we've deferred when we'll even think about filling those positions, and then compare how the revenue forecast went. But we recognize the pain that the cities of Monterey and other cities who are doing layoffs are going through. Obviously, they're much bigger organizations. In our case, we took the 2 retirements in the current year and the 3 additional positions, backfilled 1 retirement with a cheaper long-term solution with the IT specialist, and then completely deferred the other 4 for at least half a year.
And go ahead.
Yeah, so that's our layoff-like
Mm-hmm.
approach. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of places to conserve. The project expenditures are the big piece, and that chemical building at ASR is really to be the final chemical treatment for that region, if you will, those production wells. So that's a water quality issue that has to be addressed, and there's not a whole lot of room for other things other than services and supplies. I think that the budget for public outreach services will come in front of the Water Demand Committee at some point once an RFP has been out on the street for a couple months, for a month, and then reviewed for a month. So we're probably maybe 2 months best case from that, maybe 3. And that may be something that we elect to defer. We've been kind of shoestringing it right now anyway. But Suresh, maybe you've got some other ideas.
Yeah, no, we've been looking at all the costs that basically comes through, and the best we can do, we've been either outsourcing, or as Dave said, we've not been filling the positions. We went through the budget really on the revenue side, especially basically looking at all the possibilities out there, because we don't know the holes. And we're very aggressive in terms of reducing the budget to see if it will pan out with how the impact is going to cause the community itself. So like I said, on the user fee, getting down to as much as 15% reduction. So basically what that says is there's potentially a 15% reduction on the water sales. And so that's the reason why that's going to have a 15% reduction on our user fee. We looked at all of the other revenue cycles itself. So some of these revenue cycles may come up a little higher than what we have shown in here, and that's actually going to be a good thing. Also, we have every off year, we have insurance, the election cost. This year we have $200,000 election cost. So next year that's going to give us a savings of $200,000 that we're not going to see. Some of these positions that Dave talked about, if we see that the future is still bleak come 6 months from now, we don't know where the situation is leading to, we could potentially defer the hirings again for probably the next 6 months, and then don't hire anything for this fiscal year. So that will save us about $350,000 to $375,000. So there are some savings that we could potentially do. And right now we're taking the right steps. In 6 months' time, we will definitely review all of these things. So when we come to you for the mid-year budget process, we'll definitely be repeating all these things again if the economy stays this way.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that.
I have a question if we're taking questions.
So Rez, are you finished with your presentation?
There's one more slide. Let me go through real quick. And Dave, this basically is talking about the district investment policy. So what we'd like to do is address the investment policy at the same time too, and basically give the board an opportunity. The board does adopt the investment policy every year in January. but I believe they wanted to bring it again.
Well, yeah. So this past January, both at the administrative committee level and then at the total board approval, we did approve an investment policy, but I guess the committee actually looked at it and raised some questions. The only change we've made to the investment policy in the last 7 years was striking a requirement that we would rely on the county auditor controller to approve our auditor, since we only go with certified professional auditors who we didn't need the county's approval. That was the only change we've made. But as we looked at it with the committee, one area that we focused on was what are the permitted investments. And so on page 6 of the handout, you'll see 4 sections that were highlighted in red. And while this entire table of investments are the legally authorized investments from the code, and I attached the code following our investment policy, so you have a copy of the California code. If the board has any interest in tightening up the policy, having a stricter investment policy for the district than what's allowed by the state of California under the codes, I've highlighted 4 investment types that we could fairly easily do without. And the reasons are 2 separate ones. Repurchase agreements and reverse repurchase agreements have certain requirements that you've owned securities against which you're doing the repo, and they're very complex, and we've never had a need nor an interest in doing them. While we've kept it on our books as a legal investment, if you wanted to simplify or just make sure that a future CFO doesn't have the authority to get too creative, that would be, so those are the first 2 highlighted boxes. Those would be ones that we'd consider leaving. And the next 2 highlighted boxes are basically collateralized debt obligations for CDO, believe it or not. And they started with collateralized mortgage obligations. And so the idea there is these have typically been fairly highly rated by Standard & Poor's and Moody's. But what we saw in the 2008 collapse that took down Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, AIG, reinsurance, and so forth, was really the collateralized debt obligations. It turned out that the ability of the rating agencies to correctly value the credit quality was proven to be weaker than everyone thought. And that's why the key investment banks and key insurers collapsed. That's one where personally, I don't think we should be in the business of investing in collateralized debt obligations. So that would be my suggestion. But this only is if the board wants to simplify. If its direction is to simplify, then we come back with a staff note in June making these changes and looking for approval. If the board direction isn't, then we'll just keep it as is.
Well, Riley here, I'm totally in favor of tightening up, and I would still support your recommendations of eliminating those 4.
Director Hoffman brought some of this up too. He wanted to talk about some of this. I wonder if you have any comments.
Are we in the comment period now, Chair?
Dave, are y'all finished?
Yeah, just
Yes, our presentation's done. So basically, the last one is basically saying that there is no formal action required at this board meeting, but we will be taking general direction. And then basically, we will be bringing this back at the June 15th. So we can take comments and questions.
Okay, Director Evans, you want to go first and then follow up by Director Hoffman.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chair. Suresh, every year you come to us and we talk about PERS and OPEB. And my question for you is, when you talk to us, you explain that our obligation varies year to year based on a whole series of factors, run by the state. Could you possibly provide some insight on how you think things are going to go this year and next based on what's happening with investments and that sort of thing, on what direction do you think that our PERS and OPEB liabilities will go in the future years?
I only laugh because there was an article in all over the news, basically in February or March, when there was a huge market collapse of about 20% downward trend. There was a report that said PERS had lost $69 billion or something, and they got a flag for all that, all kinds of comments coming to them in terms of types of investments and what they were doing and all that. And then they just went silent. They're not reporting anything after that as to whether they're losing or gaining. But yeah, I mean, it is, all of their investments are pretty much in the market itself. So if the market does not do well, they do take a hit. The one thing in this is basically there is not going to be a hit to our 2021 numbers because they project these numbers 2 years in advance. So basically, 1 year in advance. So our 2021 contribution basically reported to us in last year in July or August. And so this year, when the report comes out, it should have come out, or it should be coming out in June, July. It will definitely take some of those market trends. And so our 21-22 numbers will definitely take some hits. In terms of how long, don't know. In terms of how much, again, I don't know. We've been tracking PERS to see what the investment rate of return is. I have not seen the March report yet in terms of the 9 months quarter. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. And as we get information, we can definitely bring it to the board's attention and just tell them what it's going to be.
Okay, so best guess, do you think that our obligation will go up or down?
It definitely will go up.
Do you think it will be a significant jump? I'm not
All-
asking for a number. I'm just,
Yeah.
small,
All
medium,
depends.
large.
Yeah, all depends on the type of investments that they have lost. Like I said,
Yeah, and remember the way we pay in is you're paying for a piece of what you pay in is to cover your share of the overall liability of the state of California's accounts. So that liability will go up. So our share of that will go up.
actually not all of California, but basically all the participants that's in the pool program,
The pool, yeah, which means you're under 50,
100 employees.
100 employees. Yeah.
So how will the court case revolving around the California rule play into this?
Which court case?
Well, my understanding, the court is going to hear the case of turning over the California rule that said you could not adjust PERS retirement after they were agreed on.
If I may, I think it's way too early to speculate how the court's going to rule on that. The court could rule very, very narrowly. The case technically is a case about pension spiking.
Right.
And so the court could use that as a means to take a look at the California rule and to truly remake the rules regarding pensions, or it could choose to act on a very, very narrow basis. If it does act in a broad basis, it's likely to do it on a prospective basis. I think that the time in grade that has already been earned is probably not going to be affected by that ruling. It's only the California rule locks in the right to earn into the future based upon the formulas that were in place when you accepted employment, or that may have changed while you were employed. But it won't change the amount for those current retirees, and it won't change unless or until there's a bargain difference with respect to current employees. That's my speculation, but I think it would be not wise to make any changes in anticipation as to how the court might rule and how it could affect your budget.
Thank you.
Director Evans, do you have any more questions?
Not right now. I'm sure more will come up later.
All right, thank you. Director Hoffman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I want to start at the end, which is this discussion about the investment policy. And Dave, I think it would be helpful if you would use attachment I, or page 6 of 6, and identify the risk levels for each of the investment types. I think that the 4 that you have identified for potentially removing are the highest risk ones from the standpoint of investment grade. But I think that there are other ones that I think if you could provide some information about the risk levels associated with each of the categories, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The interesting thing about doing so, this is already the list that the state and the Department of Finance has determined are the least risky. Their criteria are protection of principal and the liquidity to meet your obligations. And what I've always found interesting about that is, yeah, these are the least risky, but there are a couple that slipped in there that, they felt that their requirements on collateralization of the debt obligations provided the credit risk protection. Same thing with the reverse repurchase agreements and the regular repurchase agreements. It's when you were wrong that a AAA didn't really mean it was AAA, or a AA doesn't really mean it's AA. And that's what was discovered, of course, in the crash of 2008. But yeah, I'll do my best to kind of categorize those. I suppose the other thing I could do is try to take a snapshot in time and put like a current interest rate, because they're basically all interest bearing. And you should know too that within the Treasury securities area, when it talks about bills, notes, and bonds, there's what are called strips as well, where you can strip the interest payment from the principal payment for a Treasury bill, and then they become called Treasury strips, and they're still very secure, but they're an odd derivative of this. And then there are synthetic negotiable certificates of deposit that it's not even clear whether the state code allows or disallows those. But yeah, I think that's a good approach. We'll try to do that.
Yeah, because for example, on commercial paper pool fund, I mean, this would allow a general manager to put 40% of our money into a single pooled fund, or 25% into non-pooled funds, which is really risky. And so that's why I think it would be helpful for the board to understand what the potential risks are, as well as they can be identified for each of these categories. That I think that would be helpful. Going to a couple of, if we're going to general comments on the presentation, is that where we are, Chair?
Let me check with Director Potter. Director Potter, do you have anything?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Alvin. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'm curious as to what I consider to be actually, and I know Mary Adams and I are suffering through the same issue. This is not a bad budget at all. I mean, there's no layoff. There's only a 6% reduction in over the last year of 2019-2020 budget versus this year. We're still continuing ahead with capital projects. Not the most tortured budget I've ever seen. And we're not, and that's one of the reasons is because we're not economically based. I mean, we're not that dependent on the whims of the economy. But there are over 30% of our revenues are based on user fees and water supply charges. And I'm wondering, what is our game plan if there's any deferral, forgiveness, or just non-payment of those? What is the impact of that going to be on our budget? And what are we going to be doing as far as making sure that those 39%, 36% of our revenue stream is actually protected? I mean, I don't want to be out there going ahead and saying, okay, you guys didn't collect the money, so we're going to go ratchet down on you. The tendency has been to go ahead and defer those fees or those payments. And I know that's not necessarily in our control in all sectors, but I'm curious as to what would be the repercussions of that. And I'd suggest that we monitor those on a regular basis, monthly.
Yeah, I'll take the first stab of that. Suresh did point out that the assumption on property tax revenue was no annual.
Property taxes are stable. I understand that.
Yeah.
They're not going to fluctuate. So, but the others
so
fluctuate.
Our water supply charge and user fee are the ones we're concerned most about.
Exactly.
We're kind of, we track water, but the user fee for that same month comes in about 2 months later. So we have to come back and recorrelate to what the user fee looks like, because it's based on the monthly meter charge plus the monthly volumetric water sales. We have seen a little bit of decline in it even before the COVID crisis. And now we're actually seeing a slight month of this year versus the same month of last year. April was a decline in consumption or demand, which would further affect the user fee. So we're going to try to monitor all that on a following lagging basis. The water supply charge itself, as he pointed out, because it's on the assessor's bill as the collection mechanism, if there's delinquencies there, then we're just swept along with them. I'm imagining that there will be, the assessors probably statewide will be instructed to cut some slack on payment without forcing foreclosure, but eventually they'll collect it. But yeah, we're tracking.
That's my point exactly. So what is our game plan should those revenues drop off in that sector? I would suspect business is going to plummet for a while, and I would suspect that residential may actually go up. I mean, if I'm home more and I'm using more, I'm washing more dishes and showering more often or something, that may actually stay the same or even escalate a little bit if families are forced to be at home more. But I would suspect the business side of that number is going to plummet. And so I just want to make sure that, and I'd prefer it if we could on a monthly basis get an update on what those fees look like, because it is a large percentage of our revenue summary.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's our goal. And then we talked about the deferral on positions, both filling recently vacated positions and then the positions we know we're going to need. And that's our flexibility, just keep pushing it out. I don't think that we can stop our two major construction projects.
I'm not suggesting we do. I'm just saying that in the world of budgets right now, this is a budget I'd rather look at than what I'm looking at the city or what I would suspect the county's looking at. These are very, very tough times for those of us. We just looked at laying off almost 20+% of our workforce in Carmel. 16 positions, 10 unfilled. Unfilled positions are easy to vacate or defer, but the actual loss of employees is very, very heart-rendering and very difficult to do. So I would hope that we realize we're very, very fortunate to be in the position we are in, but I would offer a caveat that those two collection systems that we're looking at are a major portion of our income.
Yep, understood.
And Dave, if I may add to Director Potter's concern, so we are tracking the user fee revenue on a monthly basis. However, it's about a 45-day lag because the numbers do come from CalAm, and once the month closes, it takes them about 45 days to send us a report with a check. But we are tracking those each month as those numbers come in. And so we're very carefully monitoring those. On the property tax side, associated with our water supply charge, unfortunately, we cannot track it every month because we only get paid almost twice a year, every 6 months. So we get the first reporting in December, mid-December, and the second one comes in April. So mid-December, for example, this year, we would probably get, we would get the first report in terms of showing us where our property tax and user fee numbers are. Water supply numbers are. Typically, it comes in anywhere from 60 to 65% of the first collection. But this year, when we get in December, that's the time we'd be able to report and see if that number is right in line or if a lot of people have are being delinquent. Governor Newsom did announce something just this past week where basically he's allowing property tax penalty and interest to be waived for at least a year. So what that allows people to do is take the time and pay those property tax over a period of time as opposed to when it becomes due. So we will definitely see some delinquency issues, and that will affect both our property tax and our water supply charge. But we monitor that, and then we will monitor the monthly user fee, and we'll continue to report to the board should we see a decline higher or much higher than what we are anticipating in the budget.
Well, I offer this just as a caveat because I know property taxes, I consider them to be very, very stable. Whether people pay them or not, there's a little fluctuation in their value, but it's like sales tax or transient occupancy tax or local sales tax. Those are very, very affected by the economy. We don't have that problem in our area. I'm just worried about payments. And so if CalAm were to develop or adopt a deferral program, what does the deferral mean? And then what is the actual fallout of the deferral and people for non-payment? I know it's difficult to project. I just offer that as a warning.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good warning.
Okay, that's my comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Dave. Director Potter. Vice Chair, do you have anything else?
No, I think I'm fine.
Okay. A couple of questions from me. Dave, on this well that we're thinking about drilling, you said 3 million might not be enough. What will be enough to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It depends on which location. So we're currently preparing to take a look at one of the already approved sites. And what you can do in that case is you can do a boring, you can do a drill for monitoring well. There's different levels of information you can get. The boring will tell us something, but if we had to locate up the hill to another site, then there's a possibility of needing a pump station. However, the recent discussion, and again, it's just the last few days, the pressures at which you need to get the water up the hill, there may be sufficient pressure there without a pump station, so that'll affect things. But it could be 4 million, it could be more than 4 million. We're hopeful. So one of the things that is being looked at is whether the state revolving fund loan can be amended and opened up. And if so, that would give Monterey One Water a source of matching monies, as well as could address the mid-voltage item that we had $900,000 for in this budget, and some of the other things. So it's all just kind of fast moving right now, but we were originally told look at about 2.4 million, and then we put 3 million in there, and then we heard that the engineers are looking at possibly more than 4 million.
Okay.
Last week.
And we're talking about a larger well than the 2 wells that are, well, the 4 wells that are already up there.
Right. It'd be a similar well to the 2 deep wells because they're the workhorses. The 2 shallow wells called Veda Zone wells, they were designed to do maybe 20% of the work out there. So if you've got 2 that were designed to do 80% of the work, but you had a third one for redundancy, that gives you greater capability to either rest a well, back flush more frequently, do advanced development of that well, the variety of things. So it's probably a prudent idea. When we wrote the water purchase agreement in 2016, we had envisioned 4 of every kind of well up in that area. And it was the geotechnical specialists and the designers who said, no, you're going to be able to survive with 2 of each. And it looks like the real number is probably in between those 2.
Okay, so we're working on that, and no need of me asking you to put some more money in that well that we're thinking about drilling right now before we approve the budget.
Correct.
Say again?
Correct. I think now that we've talked about it and our eyes are wide open that we may be back with something that's more expensive, I think the authorization moving forward, in the back of your minds, you have to say, okay, if Monterey One Water doesn't have the matching monies, then our $3 million probably isn't enough. Do we have additional resources that if it took 4 at the time, I think the answer is yes. You've looked at the reserve position, but we really don't want to keep looking at our reserves as if it's a piggy bank to cover all these things. So as Suresh pointed out, if we do this well, and if we do the district doing most of it, I think we might want to get repaid rather than just writing off against the water supply charge. So there'd be either a full amortization over an extended period of time, so it's debt-like, so we get reimbursed, or partial. But we would have to come back to the board for authorization on the project anyway, and so that's when you'll know what the true story is, that it wasn't 3, it was 3.5, or it was 4, or whatever.
Okay, thank you. Arlene, can we take it out to the public if we have any public comment?
Chair, before you take it out to the public, I have one other question, if I may, or if you prefer, I'll hold it until.
No, go ahead and ask questions.
I have more additional questions myself, Chair.
Okay, Director Evans and then Director Hoffman.
Thanks, Chair. So this budget is created on the assumption that the user fee and the water supply charge will be collected throughout the year. Isn't this the year which would be beyond our original 3 years to try it out? And I thought we were going to have a discussion on continuing that, both of those charges at the same time before the 3-year trial period was up, which I thought was this summer. So if we could talk about that for a moment, I'd appreciate it.
Correct. And I think Suresh just touched on it very briefly. This budget assumes collection of both charges into the next fiscal year. The collection history is not going to be complete until August or September. So we won't have a full 3-year record until very likely September. But you are correct that we have talked about a plan and coming back to this board to talk about the plan. Here, I think we short-circuited that discussion by assuming all of it remains in place. A little bit because the concept of a third well, which is almost exactly equal to 1 full year's worth of the water supply charge collections, came up. And so we still have, instead of seeing that decrease in the need for projects on the water supply side, this redundant well will be pretty much 100% of the water supply charge.
So then we'll look towards the fall to revisit.
Yeah, I still want to have that discussion sooner than later. We've been a little concerned about this year's collection stream because rates are up. Volumes are, yes, down compared to 2 years ago and roughly flat compared to last year. But it does look like our collections on the user fee are down. One of the conjectures we had last week is, and it goes to what Director Potter was saying, if the commercial businesses, which are about 1/3 of all the water supply, are way down, but people are doing more loads of laundry and more dishwasher loads. Those two have offset each other, but the commercial meters are bigger meters. And so the meter charge revenues for commercial are higher, but those are still being collected. So we're having trouble figuring out where in the formula we might be getting hurt a little bit. And so I think once we see the April collections and we can see a clear drop of about 117 acre feet in this shelter in place April versus a year ago in April, maybe we'll have some more information, but we're actually just a little concerned about what's going on in general. We don't have a good audit trail on that, on the user fee.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's my last question.
All right,
For
thank
now.
you. Director Hoffman.
Alvin, if I might, that is my point exactly. If we could get a monthly update on that, I think that'd be really important because that is a fluctuating revenue stream. We don't really have our finger on the pulse of. Thank you.
All right, Director Hoffman, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Let me start with the capital reserve. And I appreciate the staff's efforts to attempt to put together a capital reserve, but quite honestly, a real capital reserve needs to be done by professionals to do a reserve study. And so I'm hopeful that for the next budget year, that we actually hire a professional to actually do an adequate job of establishing a reserve study that's actually comprehensive and complete. But for now, I guess that's what we have to work with, and I appreciate staff's effort to improve what we had last year. I'm concerned about this concept of adding capital projects when we don't have a capital improvement program strategy, and we just seem to add projects ad hoc in order to exaggerate expected expenditures. I think that before we start adding to the budget phantom expenditures, that we need to have a CIP program that's developed with the consultation with CalAm and M1 Water. So the way I look at this budget, I see a $2 million surplus because we are throwing in a $3 million project which won't actually have expenditures in 2020-21, but is simply to inflate expenditures so that we can justify keeping the people's money under the water supply charge. So for me, we need to have a more, and we're also showing a carryover of 7 million. So what we're doing is we're telling the people that we need their money, but we really don't. We need to give their money back. And especially now, we need to have a plan. We need to have a plan for construction projects that is comprehensive, and we don't have that. And so I'm really concerned. And I appreciate having 24 hours to review the budget. And apparently others on the board had more time to look at it and provide input. But those are my basic 24-hour comments.
No, they did not. They did not.
Okay. Arlene, can we take it out to the public, please?
Yes, I see a raised hand. Participant John, I'm going to unmute you. Please state your name and your comment.
And you have 3 minutes.
Hello?
Yes, John, please state your name and your comment.
Hi, it's John Tilley, and I sit on the Ordinance 152 Committee. And I'd like to really speak from that perspective. In regard, in particular, to the Mechanics Bank loan, the reserves that exist within that fund, Measure J, and also the sunsetting of the collection of the property taxes. The Mechanics Bank loan came forward as a need to support the ASR work. Those millions of dollars went directly to that, which was a great use of establishing a alternative water supply. So that debt currently exists, great use of it, no argument there whatsoever. Also within that fund exist sufficiently dollar for dollar type funds to pay off the Rabobank loan. The discussion earlier about the Rabobank loan did not reference the fact that those funds already exist next to that liability to just slide the funds over from the assets to the liabilities and retire that debt. Sure, part of the conversation has been around a sinking fund as one of the alternatives, but we also must remember that one of the alternatives is to take existing funds that currently exist and were collected for that purpose and use them as they were collected. So on that piece there. Supervisor Adams asked the question if there was a secret stash of dollars available for Measure J. And as a member of that 152 committee, I made comment at the time when a legal opinion was developed that the reserves that exist in that fund are eligible for Measure J funding. And I found that to be objectionable. The collection of the property tax was for alternative water supply projects, which I simply do not consider Measure J to be, but I certainly do consider ASR to be. So I think that when that secret, so when that comment is like, is there a secret stash out there? Are there funds available for Measure J? This district, you must remember, went out and got a legal opinion that said, yeah, these funds that are sitting over here in the reserve in the 152 off the property taxes can be used for Measure J. That's where some of those funds, I think, are earmarked for potential Measure J, which, by the way, when I attended Public Water Now meetings, I was told wasn't going to cost us anything. I heard that repeatedly at Public Water Now meetings. Never really did like that legal opinion, would not want to see those funds being used for Measure J instead of retiring the Mechanics Bank debt. So really, and one more thing to keep in mind here is that there's a public expectation that there is going to be a sunsetting of the property tax, and that hasn't been discussed here, and it should be. That's a chunk of your budget that's expected to go away and should go away in a number of years. So as you're looking at the budget in the long term, especially with the concerns we have in place now, please keep that in mind. And if you drain that fund and you lose the funding mechanism of it, how are you then going to pay back the debt? And when you start to hear about the multi-million-dollar wells that are going to be needed, it gets even graver as you go forward. So for me, the choice is, do you want to use the funds to pay off the Rabobank, the Mechanics Bank debt, or do you want to use it for Measure J? So please do remember that the district has agreed to sunset the property tax, and that's the public expectation. But lastly, I really want to just thank everybody for the work that you're doing. Obviously, there's been a lot of difficult developments with water supply, with wells. This is a super complicated effort that's going on, and I'm sure that the technical people that are involved are doing the work that they're doing. Thanks to Rex for an extremely good presentation. His numbers are always easy to work with, so thank you very much for that. And thank you for letting me comment.
Thank you, sir. I like the music.
All right. If anyone who's calling in would like to comment, please put *9, dial *9. And I see no raised hands, so there are no other public comments.
Okay, closing statements. Let's start with the Vice Chair.
I have no other comments.
Thank you. Director Evans, do you have any other comments?
No, I would like to address the sunsetting. I said of the water supply charge of the property tax. I'd like to discuss
No,
that.
no.
I'm sorry.
No, it is water supply charge.
It is what? Okay,
It
good.
was incorrectly
thought I
referred to
had
as a
it.
property tax. It is not a property tax.
Okay. The water supply charge. I would like to discuss that this year, and look at the OPEB. If we get any additional information from the state PERS and OPEB funds, how that will impact our budget, even if it's not this year, but in future years. I think we still need to look at that. But I think other than that, as Director Potter has said, we are in a good situation here where we can continue the organization's mission, move forward with with projects, and not have significant impacts to staff. So I think we're in a good position here. And Suresh, thank you again for a very clear, concise, and well-explained presentation.
So this is the Vice Chair again. I do have a comment. I would like to back up the fact that the 152 committee several times said that the funds were not to be used for Measure J. So I think we do have to be careful and look at what that is all about. And it was supposed to sunset, so we do have to have that discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair. Director Adams, do you have any comments? Final comments?
To say thank you to Suresh and also to Dave for putting the budget together. I thought it was a very well thought through document and clear and easy to understand. My hope is when we come back together on June 15th that we'll be able to see it as it in its final iteration. As I understand, there were a few minor changes, as Dave had mentioned, that will need to be made. So I look forward to seeing it at that time, and I appreciate everybody's efforts on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Adams. Director Rowley, do you have any final comments?
I have a couple comments, please. I would like to congratulate Suresh also on the presentation. I have a couple of questions that may be more of a narrative rather than an accounting question. But what drives the requirement to use reserves to balance our budget? I don't think it's revenue changes. I don't think it's operating expenses. But is it infrastructure charges? Is that the driver? I'd like to just have a little more clarity about what is it that drives the expense level higher that requires us to use the reserves as much as we do. That's just a general question. I don't need an answer now, but coming down the road. The other question I have is about the drought reserve itself. And I would like to see somewhere in the budget or maybe again in the narrative that when the 1,000 acre feet gets established, how do we carry that on our books? I've just lost track of that. I just want it to be clarified. They're my comments. Thank you.
All right. Director Potter, do you have any other comments?
No, I would just point out my concern about the volatility of 46% of our revenues, whether they're secure or not. And I'd like to make sure we get those reports on a monthly basis because I think they're rather speculative at this moment based on what is a changing climate out there as far as the collection sources go. The actual fact that there may be forgivenesses or deferrals. Deferrals also often end in delayed payments, which also end in, non-payments. And I think if that's 40% of our revenues, then I think we need to be really cautious of that. Other than that, I'd say that this presentation I got tonight is in marked contrast to what I went through at the city council level in Carmel last night. We're fortunate to be in the position we are, but I do think we should be cautious about as we proceed ahead based on our revenue forecast. And I do think there's a lot of value to these budget workshops. It's an opportunity for us to air concerns, give staff a heads up on what we are concerned about. And I want to thank everybody for participating tonight. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome there, Director Potter. Director Hoffman, any other final comments?
Yes, one more, and that is, I failed to mention the fact that one of the revenue line items was the ASR reimbursements from Cal-Am. And it wasn't made clear on what volume of water that it was based on. Was it based on 1,300 acre feet or 900 acre feet? And so I think that in the next, when this is brought back to the board, on top of my other comments, I think that there needs to be more clarity into how the reimbursements from Cal-Am, from ASR reimbursements are being derived. Thanks, Chair.
You're welcome. Okay, my final comments is, General Manager and our CFO, you did a great job. I think we got a full month to look at this budget some more. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that is correct.
Okay, so that gives us another round of really looking at this budget. If you have any comments, please call the General Manager and our CFO about that. So when we bring this back, also those discussions that we need to have about the sunsetting, we need to put that on. I don't know if we want to have it at the budget meeting next coming up, or we really need to schedule those that those directors brought up. So I don't know how we're going to do it, if it's in a special meeting or we do it at a regular meeting. So we need to schedule those, and y'all need to start thinking about them. I'd like to thank the staff and everyone for doing a good job on this. It's hard times right now, and I like the budget myself because we're really not laying people off. We need, we need to work harder that we don't lay nobody off, and we don't cut the citizens short or on getting this water supply going. I know it's hard. Mr. Laredo, you have anything for us?
I hope everybody has a good evening.
All right, good. General Manager, you have anything?
No, we will address some of the comments that were raised when we come back around in June. We do have a full month and 2 days, so that's plenty of time.
Yes. So please reach out, and board members, please reach out to them and tell them what your concerns are. All right. If anything, we don't have anything else, I'd like to adjourn the meeting.
Thanks again to Suresh.
Thank you, directors.
Thank you.
Thanks, Suresh and staff. Good job.
Thanks
Good
very
job.
much. Appreciate the effort.
Yep. Have a good night, everyone. Be safe this weekend.
You too.
Goodbye.